Victor Langston's life was a fortress built on precision, deadlines, and relentless ambition. At 57, he was no stranger to power, having carved his fortune brick by brick through real estate empires and multi-million-dollar developments. He was a man who believed in control, not in luck, and certainly not in compassion. The office had been quiet that day, the calm before the storm. The property manager handed him a file, the words Unit 3B, 3 months delinquent, glaring at him from the folder's corner. Victor barely looked up. Another eviction. Another day. He tucked the notice into his sleek black coat and drove across town, his Mercedes purring over cracked streets. The townhouse loomed ahead, once grand, now sagging with time's cruel touch. As he parked in the cracked driveway, he knew exactly what to expect. A quick knock, a brief exchange, and the promise of eviction. His face was set in stone, cold, impassive. He approached the door, file in hand, ready to confront the delinquent tenants. But then, the unexpected happened. The door creaked open, and there they were. Two small girls, no older than 6 or 7, standing frozen, their big dark eyes locked with his, wide and full of fear. Victor paused. The words he'd rehearsed so many times stuck in his throat. "Is your mother home?" he asked, his voice betraying a softness he hadn't anticipated. The older girl, standing a little taller, shook her head, but it was the younger one who spoke, her voice a tremble. "Please, don't take our home," she begged, stepping forward. "We're waiting for Mommy. She said Mr. Langston would help us." Victor's heart skipped a beat. The last name hung in the air like a specter, an old ghost from a life he thought was long buried. The crumpled envelope the girl handed him confirmed his worst fear. Elena. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected them. Victor's mind raced as he unfolded the letter from Elena, the woman from his past he had buried deep under the weight of his success. The words were brief, yet they hit him like a hammer. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I didn't want to ask you like this, but they have no one else. Their names are Lily and Laya. Please take care of them." His hand trembled as he held the note, his eyes darting between the two girls, whose faces were a blend of confusion and desperate hope. He had never imagined this. Never imagined Elena would leave him with something more than a memory. The weight of the situation settled on his chest, suffocating him. He had built his empire on logic and control. But in that moment, the world around him felt out of control. The girls stood there, vulnerable and waiting, their eyes not just pleading for safety, but for something much bigger. For him. "Where's your mother now?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't quite swallow. Laya, the younger girl, stepped forward, her tiny hands clasped tightly in front of her. "She said she had to go fix something. She never came back." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and the room seemed to close in on him. Victor stepped into the small apartment, his breath catching in his throat. The place was dim, cold even, and the smell of stale air mingled with the faint scent of lavender. A few empty cereal boxes sat on the kitchen counter, and a small note on the fridge reminded the girls how to warm up leftovers. No signs of life, no warmth, just an empty shell of what should have been a home. Victor could barely breathe as he surveyed the space. The report he had once held in his hand felt irrelevant now. The cold professionalism he had carried with him all these years shattered in that moment. His mind raced, but his body remained rooted. He had to find Elena. Victor's heart pounded in his chest as he paced around his penthouse, unable to focus on anything but the two little girls still waiting for him. He couldn't stop thinking about their faces, Lily's quiet strength and Laya's vulnerability. They had become his responsibility in a heartbeat, and it terrified him. He had always believed that success came from calculated decisions, from control, but this was something entirely different. This wasn't business. This was personal. And it was unraveling everything he thought he knew. The call to the private investigator had barely ended before Victor found himself staring at the screen of his laptop, searching for any trace of Elena. The investigation came up empty. No record, no hospital visits, no answers. She had simply vanished, leaving behind only those two girls, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the last remnants of a promise Victor had made years ago, one he never thought he would have to keep. He leaned back in his chair, exhausted. His eyes fell to the photo on his desk, the one of him and Elena, so long ago. They had shared moments of happiness before everything had spiraled into the business world that consumed him. He had left her behind, just like he left everything else. The thought of her now, disappeared, lying in some nameless hospital, made him sick to his stomach. She had always been more than just a woman to him. She was a connection, a lifeline he had severed with ambition. But now, he had to fix it. The next day, Victor found himself back at the apartment. The girls were still there, sitting in silence, their eyes never leaving the door. The hope that had been in their gaze when they first met him had dimmed. "Are you taking us away now?" Lily asked softly, as though her voice was too tired to even ask. Victor knelt down, his heart breaking. "No," he said, voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I'm taking you somewhere safe." He stood, and in that moment, he knew there was no going back. The next few days blurred together for Victor, each one a mix of quiet tension and the constant hum of unanswered questions. His penthouse, once a sanctuary of polished luxury, now felt alien. There were toys scattered on the floor, blankets draped over the couch, and the smell of pancakes still hanging in the air. Lily and Laya had begun to settle in, but the silence that followed their arrival was thick with unspoken emotions. They were adjusting, just as he was, to the new, uncomfortable reality they were all thrust into. Victor sat at his kitchen table, looking across at the two girls who were slowly becoming the center of his world. They were eating breakfast, cereal, the only thing he knew how to make without screwing up. And despite their quiet smiles, their eyes kept flicking back to the door. It was as though they expected someone to walk through it at any moment. Someone who would make everything go back to the way it was before. But no one came. It was just him, and the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a 1,000-pound boulder. He had barely gotten used to the idea of being their guardian when the phone call came. The private investigator, her voice grim, told him she'd found Elena. She was in a coma. She'd been in a car accident, and for nearly 3 weeks, she'd been listed under Jane Doe in a county hospital. Victor's heart dropped into his stomach, and for a moment, everything around him seemed to fade. He couldn't breathe. He had failed her. Victor drove to the hospital in a daze, his mind racing with images of Elena, her laugh, her warmth, the way her eyes had looked at him that day at the coffee shop so long ago. When he saw her, lying motionless in that sterile hospital bed, all of the walls he had so carefully built around his emotions crumbled. He sat by her side, holding her hand, his heart filled with regret. "I should have stayed," he whispered, but she didn't respond. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and endless hours spent at Elena's bedside. Victor barely slept, consumed by a gnawing sense of guilt and helplessness. He had always believed in controlling his world, shaping it to his will, until now. Sitting in the sterile, dimly lit hospital room, he could do nothing but wait. Elena's fragile form lay motionless, and every beep of the machines felt like a reminder of how much he had failed her. Victor couldn't help but think back to the last time they had spoken. She had been so full of life, so determined. The memory of their last conversation, about the future, about her fears for the girls, played on a loop in his mind. He wished he had done more. He should have been there for her. But now, all he could do was sit by her side and pray that she would wake up, that she would somehow pull through. It wasn't until the DNA results came back that the full weight of the situation crashed down on him. He wasn't their father. He had never been. The shock of it hit him like a freight train, and for a moment he felt the ground beneath him shift. The tears that had been welling up inside him for days finally spilled over. He wasn't their father. He wasn't even related to them. But in that moment, it didn't matter. Lily and Laya weren't his by blood, but they were his now. He had promised Elena that he would take care of them, and no matter what, he would keep that promise. He didn't care about biology, about family trees, about any of the things that had once mattered so much to him. What mattered now was the girls. What mattered now was giving them the life they deserved, a life that didn't involve waiting in vain for someone who would never come back. With resolve solidifying in his chest, Victor returned to the townhouse the next morning. The girls were waiting, as always. They hadn't moved from their spot at the table, eyes hopeful, yet somehow resigned. "No," he said softly, kneeling beside them. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to make sure you're safe." Victor stood in the quiet of his penthouse, staring at the phone screen in his hand. His heart was heavy with the weight of the decision he had made, but there was no turning back now. The girls were his responsibility, and they were going to be all right. But Elena's fate was something entirely different. He hadn't prepared himself for this level of uncertainty. The thought that she might never wake up gnawed at him, and yet there was a strange comfort in knowing that at least the girls were safe with him. They weren't just some assignment or obligation. They were family. He glanced at the clock. The time had come. His private investigator had found Elena, alive but unconscious, in a county hospital. The news hit him hard, but there was still a glimmer of hope. At least she hadn't been lost to him completely. The car crash had taken its toll on her, leaving her body bruised and battered, but he knew she had survived. And now the truth about the girls had begun to unravel in the most unexpected way. Victor rushed to the hospital, his steps echoing in the sterile hallways. The door to the ICU opened, and the sight of Elena lying there, tubes in her mouth, surrounded by machines, made his stomach twist. But there she was, Elena. He gently pulled a chair to her side and sat, his hand trembling slightly as he brushed a lock of hair from her face. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have been there." The words felt so inadequate, but it was all he had. He wasn't prepared to see her like this, and the guilt that surged through him threatened to break him. Days passed in a haze of uncertainty. Victor spent every waking hour at the hospital, sitting by Elena's side, watching over her, praying for any sign that she might awaken. The girls, Lily and Laya, stayed in his penthouse, adjusting to their new life with quiet resilience. Every time he saw them, their trusting eyes reminded him of the promise he had made to their mother. And every time he looked at their faces, he knew he was doing the right thing. But what he couldn't shake, what haunted him at night, was the question of what the future would hold. Would Elena wake up? Would she remember anything? What if she never did? Victor sat in the dimly lit room, his hands clenched tightly on the edge of his chair. His thoughts were a blur of confusion, guilt, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. The weight of the girls' lives, now in his hands, was something he hadn't prepared for. But here they were, his family, and he would protect them no matter what. Every night he would return to the penthouse, only to find the girls sitting at the kitchen table, eyes wide and waiting for him like tiny guardians of a future he wasn't sure he could give them. But the news of Elena's condition was something he couldn't ignore. He knew she was recovering, slowly, painfully. But he wasn't sure what would come next. Would she want to raise the girls? Would she remember the life they once had? And what about him? The bond they shared years ago, before he ran off to chase his career, still lingered in his mind like an unfinished melody. But it didn't matter now. Did it? What mattered was the girls, and they were safe. Then came the moment that shattered all the tension. A phone call. The voice on the other end was firm but kind, telling him that the DNA results had come in. The girls were not his by blood. The bombshell hit him harder than any of the challenges he'd faced in the corporate world. His knees buckled for a second, the room spinning around him. He wasn't their father. He wasn't even related. But in that moment, as his heart pounded in his chest, one undeniable truth rang louder than anything else. They were his now. Blood or not, they were his responsibility. With the truth settling into his bones, he walked to the living room where Lily and Laya were huddled together on the couch, their faces still soft with sleep. Victor took a deep breath, his voice steady but gentle as he knelt beside them. "I'm not your real dad," he said, trying to fight the lump in his throat. "But I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to be scared anymore." Lily's small arms wrapped around his neck, her whispered words breaking the silence. "I knew you were good." And as Victor hugged her tightly, he realized that being their father wasn't about blood. It was about the love and trust they had given him, and he would never break that bond. He had found his purpose again. The silence in the room was deafening. Victor stood there, his eyes scanning the faces around him, but the only person he saw was Lily, her small hands clutching his own, her wide eyes full of trust. He could hear the faint sound of the elevator doors closing behind him as the last of the security guards exited the building. It was a moment he had never imagined, one that felt like a weight pressing down on him, but at the same time, it was liberating. This was the beginning of something bigger, something that had been years in the making. He had spent his life building an empire, brick by brick, contract by contract, but none of it had ever felt as important as the task ahead of him now. He turned, glancing at the now vacant desks of the three people who had tormented Lily and Laya, the same ones who had thrown her life into chaos for their amusement. His anger was palpable, but there was no time to indulge in that. There was too much at stake. Victor's phone buzzed in his pocket, the vibration jolting him from his thoughts. He pulled it out, seeing a text message from his lawyer with a single line of cryptic text. "The case is moving forward." He felt a chill crawl down his spine. It was one thing to deal with the corporate scum who had bullied him and his family. It was another to face the ramifications of what came next. He had no idea just how deep this would go. But one thing was clear. He wasn't walking away, not this time, not after what they had done to the girls. He had spent too long being the corporate shark chasing money, power, and prestige. But now, as he looked into Laya's eyes, as Lily snuggled closer to his side, Victor knew that everything he had built was meaningless without them. "I'm going to fix this," he whispered softly to himself, making a silent promise to the girls, to himself. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Victor sat in his downtown penthouse, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. His hands gripped the edge of the sleek glass table, his mind racing as the events of the day replayed in his head. The image of Lily's face, her desperate eyes filled with hope and fear, haunted him. He had never imagined his life would take this turn. Not like this. Not for a pair of little girls he barely knew. But they had become his responsibility in a way he hadn't expected. And now, with every fiber of his being, he was determined to make things right. The phone call from the private investigator still echoed in his ears. "She's in a coma. No ID. At a county hospital." The words had been a punch to the gut. Elena, the woman from his past, the one who had carried his promises and secrets, was alive. Just barely. And he hadn't been there for her. The guilt gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. There was no time for self-pity. He had a family to protect now, and that meant dealing with the truth. Victor grabbed his coat and headed out the door, his footsteps quick and determined as he made his way through the sleek corridors of the building. The elevator ride felt like an eternity, the stillness of the night pressing down on him. When the doors finally opened, he was met with the cold, sterile air of the county hospital. He stepped out, his heart racing, and made his way down the quiet hall to the ICU. And there she was, Elena. Her face bruised, her body hooked up to machines, but there was no mistaking her. It was her. Victor's breath caught in his throat as he pulled up a chair beside her bed. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I should have stayed." The weight of the years between them, the regrets, the missed opportunities, it all crashed down on him at once. But there was no turning back now. His life, their lives, had changed forever, and he was ready to face whatever came next. Victor sat across from the girls, their faces small and fragile in the dim light of his office. Lily and Laya clung to each other, their little hands trembling as they stared at him with wide, trusting eyes. His mind swirled with thoughts of everything that had led him to this moment. The Coca-Cola incident, the cruel laughter, the phone call about Elena. He could feel the weight of their silent plea, the hope in their eyes that he would somehow make things right. They didn't know who he was, who they were to him, and yet they believed in him, just as Elena had once believed. He swallowed hard, trying to push aside the rush of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. He had promised Elena he would help, but he never imagined it would come to this. His gaze flickered to the photo of the little girls on the table, his daughters. They weren't his by blood, but they were his in every way that mattered. He couldn't leave them in this broken world, not when they needed him the most. He had to be their father, their protector. "Are you taking us away now?" Lily asked in a small, uncertain voice, her eyes searching his face for answers. Victor's heart clenched. He knelt down, gently brushing a stray lock of hair from Laya's face. "No," he said softly, his voice steady. "I'm taking you somewhere safe." The words felt like a promise. He wasn't just taking them to his penthouse, he was taking them into his life, into the family he had never expected to have but was now ready to embrace fully. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Without taking his eyes off the girls, he pulled it out and glanced at the screen. The message was from his attorney. "We've secured everything. It's done." Victor felt a surge of relief mixed with anticipation. The adoption papers were signed. The house, the life, everything was ready. The next chapter was beginning. He stood up, took their tiny hands in his, and led them out of the room. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be,